Thank you. I move amendments 1 and 4 to 9 as circulated in my name. We must first start to acknowledge that our environmental laws are broken and that these bills, whilst a welcome step, do little to fix them. This is called Tranche 2 of the reforms from the Minister. Tranche 1 included a water trigger and was passed late last year. And it was great to legislate it, but unfortunately it is completely ineffective if it is not actually used. And I should say to the Minister, because as we consider these amendments in this bill and consider whether it will be effective in improving environmental protection, we do look to past conduct. And the problem is, in relation to, for example, the Tambora and Beetaloo gas project, a number of us have written to the Minister asking her to use those new powers under Tranche 1 of the reform to call that project in to be assessed in relation to its water use. And unfortunately, earlier this week, we received a letter from the Minister really stating unsatisfactory excuses as to why this gas project remains unreferred under the EPBC Act, despite grave concerns and a past history by this proponent of being fined for dumping wastewater. So it begs the question, these legislations before us will not have the effect that is stated unless they are robust and they are utilised and that the intent is in fact very clear and specific. So, and as I understand it, all of the amendments and the discussions that have been had with the Minister and her team, whilst I very much thank the opportunity to do that, the difficulty is it does not appear that there is any willingness to actually accept any amendments that are all here and reasonable to ensure better legislation. So, in terms of the amendments that I am moving now, they are absolutely reasonable and sensible. In fact, some were even included in the Minister and the Government's own nature-positive consultation documents, but later dropped. In particular, they introduced clear objects and duties to ensure the duties of the EPA formed under this legislation and with the Minister can achieve, amongst other things, the enhancement of the Australian environment. We need to be specific about the objects of this legislation and the EPA formed under this legislation. This amendment provides greater transparency and accountability for offsets to ensure proponents are not double counting offsets, as were reported just recently in the media. The amendments include providing a more detailed objects to the Environment Protection Australia Bill, linking those objects to the EPA's duties and any ministerial statement of expectations and minister's statement of intent. Now, my concern is, as the legislation is currently drafted, is without being explicit in the legislation, we will have different ministers who can then make vastly different statements of expectations and statements of intent, which very much lower the bar when it comes to the expectations of how this EPA will work. Objects and duties guide the EPA in their activities and assist decision-making, and they actually make it arm's length from that political intervention. So it's really important for it to be specific in the legislation. It also keeps the EPA accountable to delivering the outcomes that this legislation seeks to achieve. It's one of the key mechanisms in which decisions can be reviewed by the courts to ensure they are consistent with the objects of the legislation. Now, I note the Minister in my discussions flagged potential legal complexities regarding having objects in this way. But the EPA equivalents in states such as New South Wales and Victoria still contain quite comprehensive objects within their EPA legislations, whilst discharging responsibilities relating to many other environmental laws that also have their own objects. And I should say I did a search of all the laws that this EPA would essentially enact, and not all have detailed objects, and so there are gaps that need to be addressing. The Minister's own press release on the Tranche 2 reforms recognised the concerning results also of an offsets audit and the need to urgently strengthen enforcement of offsets. Yesterday, the media reported that Department's audit of 20 offset sites showing 30% of sites had worse conditions than the offsets plan and 2 sites had overlapping with existing offset sites. So I'm also moving an amendment to include an additional register of offsets to avoid this overlap. It will provide greater transparency about where offsets have been secure, have been secured, what offsets have been secured, and that they are continuing in perpetuity. I also wholly support the amendments moved by the member for North Sydney and her amendments to improve transparency with documentation having to be registered and those definitions. It's important that communities have visibility as to the reasoning by the decision-making body and that there is transparency around that, not just a duty to a proponent of an application, but also that it should be stating that duty to communities. I should note further amendments must be made in tranche 3, and we have been promised that that is coming, especially around offsets and like-for-like.
The honourable member, you've gone over time. Would you like to continue on? If you seek continuation. Thank you. The member has the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. So I welcome the establishment of the EPA to bring independence and rigour to a system that we all acknowledge is broken. There is no doubt about that. We need a strong cop on the beat. But that cop, that Environmental Protection Authority, will only be able to do what the powers in this legislation and the objects set out. And that's why it is so important for them to be specific and to be included. And I should say it was, as I've said already, it was in the Minister and the Department's own initial consultation process and document. So I am concerned that the Minister has lost the opportunity to reach the full potential of the EPA by failing to adopt these and the other amendments proposed by my members of the crossbench.
I thank the honourable member and give the call to the Minister.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Warringah for moving these amendments. I know that her constituents place a very high value on the natural environment. They live in a beautiful part of Australia and really want us all to look after our environment better. I also believe that her constituents would very much support the setting up of Australia's first national independent Environment Protection Agency. But I'm not going to support these amendments, and some of the reasons I've already outlined, as they complement some of the amendments that have been moved by other speakers. This Act sets up Environment Protection Australia. The environmental objectives that the member has asked for, the objectives of the Act, as she alluded to, my response to her has already been that these objectives exist in the acts that the Environment Protection Agency administers. So I'll give an example. The member for Warringah seeks to, in her amendment, seeks to include an objective that, that the EPA should enhance the protection of Australia's environment and prevent the degradation of Australia's environment. But the Environment Protection Agency is being set up to administer a number of acts. Just one of them is the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, and the objects of this Act include to provide for the protection of the environment, especially those aspects of the environment that are matters of national environmental significance, to promote the conservation of biodiversity, to provide for the protection and conservation of heritage, and to promote a cooperative approach to the protection and management of the environment involving governments, the community, landholders and Indigenous peoples, to assist in the cooperative implementation of Australia's international environmental responsibilities, to recognise the role of Indigenous people in the conservation and ecologically sustainable use of Australia's biodiversity, and to promote the use of Indigenous people's knowledge of biodiversity with the involvement of and in cooperation with the owners of the knowledge. I just think, Mr Deputy Speaker, that including objects that enhance the protection of Australia's environment when the bills that are the acts that are being administered by the organisation already provide for the protection of the environment, promote the conservation of biodiversity, it just is redundant. Mr Deputy Speaker, as I said, the EPA will not just be regulating the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act and approvals under it. It will also, for example, regulate approvals under the Ozone Protection and Synthetic Greenhouse Gas Management Act Those objectives include more specific things like giving effect to Australia's obligations under the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol, and replacing depleting substances and synthetic greenhouse gases. So I'm very happy to continue to work with the crossbench on how the objectives of the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act can be meaningfully improved in stage 3 of the reforms. But the purpose of this bill is to set up the agency as an administrative act. We need to do it in a considered and methodical way. On the issue of the offsets register, this amendment's unnecessary because I've done it. I've done it already. The member alluded to a review done by the Department of Offsets. I commissioned that review, and I commissioned the review because I was worried about offsets. I'm hearing the same stuff you are, so I asked the department to look at offsets and to evaluate whether they had been properly delivered. And as the member said, in many cases they had not been properly delivered. So what I've done is set up a register that anyone can look up online. You can look at the name, you can look at the location of the site, you can find the offset conditions for each project. I've also, this is just one of the changes that I've asked for as a result of the review that I commissioned. We've basically set up a permanent compliance unit to look at offsets because I've got the same concerns as the concerns that you've raised. We found, as you said, as the member said, 1 in 7 approved projects were potentially non-compliant. 21 of them have already been subject to compliance actions, including a request to either fix their offsets or they've been issued with an infringement notice. I just want to go in continuation, if that's possible.
Absolutely. The Minister's seeking a continuation.
Just for 1 minute, thank you. 21 projects, as I said, have been subject to compliance actions. 9 infringement notices have been paid already. 3 directed variations have been issued. I just want to reassure the member who I think is raising very valid concerns about offsets, that I believe the fact that I've now established that register, that we've set up the compliance unit, that we've taken compliance action, I think means that we don't need to change the law here. We need to, as she said herself, make sure that we're putting the law into practice.